Could you tell us about the Robertson-Huron Treaty and what it meant for the Anishinaabe of Bouting?
Well, the Robinson-Huron Treaty and the Robinson-Superior Treaty, for starters, William Robinson, who came up here to negotiate and sign those documents, had been a mine manager at Bruce Mine, so Shinwa knew him. William Robinson was also part of the Upper Canadian establishment and part of the group of people who had mining interests throughout the North Shore. So he himself, you couldn't say you couldn't say he had put all his business dealings aside and stepped away from them. I highly suspect he was dealing with his business interests in mind. Some of the people that were with Robinson, such as former Indian agent William Keating, had mines located that he'd speculated in, including apparently one on or near Garden River. I have to check exactly where he had it. But definitely he had interests at Bruce Mines. They had an American Métis man, George Johnston, who was willingly selling information about where mining locations were to these people also working for the government. And other, ne'er-do-wells or do-wells, depending how you want to look at them, working for the government. On our side was Shinwa and the chiefs of the North Shore, Huron and Superior, and Robinson was instructed to get one treaty. Because he couldn't convince the leadership from basically Nebnegojing and Batchewana over to Penetanguishene, he couldn't convince them to sign under certain rotten conditions. And because a majority of the leadership from Lake Superior weren't at the meeting, because they were afraid of cholera, falling into a trap, misnegotiations, and other things, they refused to come. He quickly signed a treaty with the Robinson Superior people, and he basically said, well, you wanted me to do one, but I really did two. So they're really, there's quite similar documents, and they're supposed to be one treaty. For the government, it meant they got thousands of acres of land. For the government, they think it was a one-time land deal where we surrendered our sovereignty, we gave them permission to do all these mines. And the minute the treaty was signed, the government started breaking it, which is typical. The government of Canada signed the Nunavut Agreement in 1999 or what, in late 1990s. They're already breaking that one, right? I mean, it's just standard. They sign an agreement, they break it. But for us, the Anishinaabe, the idea behind it is that we would share land with the settlers. That was what they called the surrendered lands. Immediately problem there in interpretation, right? For us, we were sharing it. To them, we gave it to them. I'm dubious as to if that was exactly explained that way. Probably wasn't actually. I don't have to be dubious about it. For us, on our reserves, like the one at Garden River, our reserve at Garden River, it was withdrawn or withheld from sale, so it's really unceded land. The sovereignty was never given to the Canadian government. It was never shared with the government. It was intended for the Anishinaabe people, specifically Shinwa and his followers. So that was one thing it meant for us. It guaranteed us a huge land base that the government of Canada constantly whittled away until recently when we got some of it back, but they were constantly whittling away at it. It guaranteed us hunting and fishing rights throughout the region, so we could continue, for those who wanted to, could continue that way of life. It guaranteed a way of creating an economy on the reserve, because as far as Shinwa and others were concerned, actually all the leadership seems to have had the idea that our reserves, we were sovereign on it, so we could do what we wanted on them. So if we wanted to set up, and they tried to do this, set up a steamer cordwood industry where they cut logs for the steamers for them to use on the boating in the lakes. We could do that. We could cut ships' timbers. We could do whatever we wanted that was our forests. If we wanted to sell the minerals on our land, Garden River has their stuff on Garden, we could sell those things. The Canadian government, however, the Upper Canadian government and later the Canadian government didn't see it that way. We put in Shinwa had an escalator clause, or managed to get an escalator clause inserted into the treaty, where we got an annuity every year, but when the government could afford it, the money would go up, right? Now, and I think the last time it went up was the 1880s to $4. Western groups, 16, 17, 18, 20, a lot more money. Whenever I talk to First Nation people from the West, they go, you only get $4? Really? $4? Yes. But the interesting thing about this is in 1867, the government of Canada creates this two-step on us without our permission. And the two-step is that Ontario gets to control all the public lands and resources in the province. The federal government gets a hold of First Nations. Well, if our annuity money is based on resource revenues, the government of Canada is responsible for our annuity payments. The government of Canada can't increase our annuity payments, they say, because they don't have any money. And the reason they have no money is they don't get resource revenues. That's the government of Ontario. And the government of Ontario doesn't give resource revenues to Ottawa to give to us. Right? So there's this little two-step dance they impose. I have friends who do Canadian history at this time period, and they argue that this was just the way they decided to do it, blah, blah, blah. I don't think it was, they say, oh, it was accidental, it was this, it was that, it was just assuage, independence feelings. I think for Upper Canadian negotiators, Sir John A. Macdonald and others, they knew very well it would undermine treaty rights by splitting lands and splitting who controlled First Nations. So, the treaty meant a great deal for us. It was supposed to, protect our sovereignty, ensure that we had a way of making our way in the world however our people wanted. If some wanted to, go to school, learn to read and write, and pursue businesses, barrel making, farming, those people could. Other people who wanted to continue pursuing what anthropologists and others have called our traditional ways. It's our ways, we could have, they could have done that. Right, but the government of Canada, like I say, they pretty much started breaking the treaty once they signed it. So we're still fighting for that recognition. The chiefs of the North Shore, the chiefs in Sault Ste. Marie, are still fighting for those recognitions that these are our rights.
Could you tell us about the Penfather Treaty of 1859 and what it meant for the Anishinaabe people of Wadding?
Land theft. That's the simple answer on that one. Penfather treaties of 1859 are questionable. They're under some parts of them are under land claims, have been or are, because of how they were negotiated. What it essentially did was Batchewana lost their entire reserve, Thessalon as well, right? And those Thessalon and Batchewana First Nations, mainly Batchewana though, got dumped at Garden River. Partly because Augustine Bogowajnini, of the two leaders at Garden River, welcomed them. According to some recorded oral tradition and according to spoken and according to European written documents, those two chiefs promised to treat people from Batchewana as their own because they were their relations, sharing all the rights and privileges. Later, Indian agents claim that the people from Batchewana had the right of residency, but they had no rights to anything else, so they couldn't hunt, they couldn't fish, they couldn't cut logs or anything on Garden River's reserve because it wasn't theirs. But they could, they could live there. I'm not quite sure how you can see the economic problems, right? You can't hunt for food, you can't, they had but that was the Indian agents trying to split the reserve, split the community. And it really meant, Garden River lost about half its land base in those treaties. Penfather and the people that negotiated that, including Judge Prince, the great honorable Judge Prince, were basically in it for the mineral resources that this would free up and in it for the forestry resources this would free up for their own personal reasons. And it wasn't really, and to say the least, it wasn't even a fair treaty. It wasn't even, at least, in 1850, we had forced the issue. We had brought the negotiators to the table. Our leadership may not have got the treaty they wanted, but at least they had a chance to negotiate. In 1859, from the readings and from what I've been told, there wasn't a lot of negotiation. It was, here's the treaty, if you sign this is what's going to happen. If you don't sign it, this is what's going to happen, et cetera, right? It's hugely problematic, and we've been, Anishinaabe, who fell under these different Penfather treaties, have been trying to undo them for quite a while.
So could you tell us about what the Indian Act meant for the Anishinaabe of Wadding?
Well, when the Indian Act was created in 1876, it followed through, how do I sum this up? I teach a whole course on the Indian Act. It's like, how do I sum this up? It was based on earlier legislation, right? So under the Indian Act, various things came into play, were created or reinforced, like the marrying out provisions, right? For Anishinaabe women who married non-Indians, this meant that they were no longer Indians. Under the Indian Act, though, and the way Canadian government did things, many Indians, such as the Potawatomis from the United States, were not considered Indians in Canada. So if an Anishinaabe woman from Sault Ste. Marie married a Potawatomi man, she was a non-Indian, right? Like, I mean, you know, and it's like when you start thinking about this, it's like, what? Like, you know, but if she moved to the States with her husband, she'd be considered Indian. But in Canada, neither of them were. There were certain ways around that. It was really difficult, but this is, you know, some of the issues that were going on. There was issues imposed where people from Garden River, if they moved into the United States and lived there for 5 consecutive years, you lost your band membership. You lost your right to treaty monies. You appear to have kept your right to claim status in Canada, and you could rejoin the band, provided the band council passed a resolution saying they wanted you added back onto the lists, and provided the Ministry of Indian Affairs and the Minister of Indian Affairs agreed to follow through with the petition. There's a bunch of orphans. There's at least a dozen people that I've found in the records for Indian Affairs that were basically, some of them were orphans. Their parents died. Their 2 parents, their mom and dad, died in the States. The family, the kids, got given out to relations in the U.S. to be looked after. A couple of them ended up, I think one of them ended up at the Carlisle boarding school in the States. And they moved back to Garden River, and the Indian agent would not recognize them as being from Garden River or having any rights because they'd lived in the States for more than 5 consecutive years. The trail runs cold on, the trail runs into, by the 1920s, they still hadn't been added to the banned lists, but it's hard to trace them after the 1920s because those membership files for the Department of Indian Affairs are still sealed under privacy laws. I know that they're still being asked to join the reserve into the 1930s, and some of them never do. The family just gives up. So that's another aspect of the Indian Act that affected people, because here in Sault Ste. Marie, you want to work, well, you go across the river, right? Yeah. You know, there's a big forestry industry over there. I mean, a lot of the Finns that migrated to Sault Ste. Marie ended up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan working in the logging industry. They just moved across the river. You know, so if we did the same, we lost all sorts of things. So it meant the government of Canada imposed an elected system of governance. When Augusta died, 1890, 91, the government of Canada imposed an elected system on our community. And ever since then, Garden River has elected chiefs, right, and elected councils. There's no more, the traditional system is gone, at least legally gone. And if we want to even attempt to recreate a version of what we had prior to 1890, the government of Canada will not recognize it. All the recognized systems of governance on reserves have to be democratically elected, right? And even when they have these things called custom band elections, it's slight modifications to the elected system. You know, it took our children away through imposed education curriculums where they absolutely had to go to day school. If they didn't go to day school, they had to go to a residential school. I mean, that changed in the early 20th century where they could also be shipped out to boarding schools, but I mean, residential school, white-run boarding school, is there much of a difference? It imposed that the government had control over our band finances. It created the Indian agent who was in control of the community essentially until the 1960s. And then the band offices were created. It means that our elected governments, despite us electing them, are actually more responsible to Ottawa than to the people who elected them. It just undermined and tried to do so many things and has really damaged the communities in many ways. I mean, it hasn't gotten rid of everything that it wanted to get rid of. I don't think it ever could have, but just by the fact that it damaged our governance systems has affected our communities.
Could you tell us about the work of missionaries at Sault Ste. Marie during the 1800s?
Yeah, the much maligned missionaries. I find it really humorous. Everybody has today this really negative view of these missionaries. And I talk about them and everyone thinks, oh my God, you're defending these horrible people. I don't defend the horrible ones. And there are really bad ones here in the Sioux. But ones like William McMurray was actually very good friends with Shinwa. Shinwa and McMurray carried on a correspondence up until Shinwa's death. Shinwa, McMurray and his wife Charlotte came up here to visit him. You know, you don't hear about that, right? Oh, missionaries are evil. But McMurray and Shinwa actually had a good relationship, a very good relationship. And I think it's partly because McMurray's wife, being Métis, kept McMurray restrained. Like, no, you got to behave this way, right? Which led to this good relationship. Then there's Reverend Bingham. He seems to be well respected by his small little congregation of people. But when he left Sault Ste. Marie, the Baptist church closed its mission down, and the Baptists, the people who were, saw themselves or claimed to be followers of Bingham, melded away and became Methodists. Like, he left no real lasting legacy, so it's like, was he much of an impact? So some of these missionaries, then there's Catholic priests that were horrible, but there's this one, August Kohler, who apparently was very well liked. Had a name, people come out to meet him, and so on. So it's but what's interesting in these missionaries is some of the people in this region, there's different men and women who are baptized by every church in the region, right? So they're baptized first by the Baptists. Reverend Bingham actually has a funny one. He likes to baptize people in January. He does that because in the Baptist faith it's full immersion and as an adult, right? So what they do is he sees it as a test of their faith and dedication to God. Is if you're willing to go in a white shift, so basically a white nightgown, out to the St. Mary's River in January to be fully baptized in a hole in the ice, you're willing to stand by his church. Now you have to admit that's quite the test. So he only ever has about 26 people that go to his church as he sees as Baptists. I mean, not a lot of people want to do this. There's one guy who actually says no thank you and walks away from his church. I think he becomes a Methodist and even a minister in the Methodist church, but he just does, you want me to do what in January? No. But these people, some of them did very much defend Indigenous rights. Reverend Bingham fought under American Indian removal policy. They were supposed to be removing the Chippewa from the American side of the river. Bingham fought against it. He tried buying lands, so did the Methodist Church on the American side, bought up lands so people could live on those lands, because technically if they're living on private land, they can't be removed under American law. It's only on treaty lands. So they were, so there's different things they did. But on the other hand, I also, in saying that these guys, tried to do a lot of things, I mean, you also have to recognize that they were here to make people Christians and to destroy the old ways, right? And this is where I come to some of these funny characters, is one of them got baptized by the Baptists. The Methodists showed up, did this very wonderful camp meeting where, everybody's out yelling, screaming, praying, and shaking in the aisleways, and converts to Methodism, gets baptized. I think he got baptized by John Sunday, who's an Ojibwa minister out of Credit River in Ontario. Then McMurray shows up, and towards the end of McMurray's tenure here as a missionary, the Anglicans baptize him, and then he dies a Catholic. So every religion who came in, he was baptized by. And there's a number of people that do this. They do 2 or 3, right? And it's not always Catholics becoming Protestants. Sometimes it's Protestants becoming Catholics, and other times it's Protestants, Catholic back to Protestant, depending. And I think it depends on, and what it seems to be is it depends on their personal relationship with that missionary. If they like the guy, he's helpful, why not? I'll join your church. If they don't like him, they leave the church. So, there's a lot of an ability here to move in and out. But like I say, at the same time, I mean, these people were here to convert, to get rid of the old belief systems. So.
Could you tell us about the speech of Chief Shinwa delivered at Sault Ste. Marie, August 20th, 1849?
How about I just say Shinwa's speeches in 1849? Because he did a few. These speeches and what they're getting at is an Anishinaabe right to the land. He is using usually imagery that the Americans signed treaties with the Anishinaabe, whereas the British government won't. So he's trying to shame them, because there's this myth, even in 1849, 1840 Canada, that the Americans treat their Indians horribly and Canada does much better at it, right? Which is actually a huge myth. And he's trying to shame the government of Canada into doing this. So he issues a whole series of speeches in the 1840s, and there's 2 or 3 in 1849, one of which I sent you guys to look at. And they're all arguing essentially is this is our land, you promised to help us, the Americans are doing this, why aren't you? And that, that's the general tenor of all these speeches. And they're interesting. They're all recorded in English, and Shinwa didn't speak English, so there is a translation issue there in what is actually being said. But when you read them, it comes across very strongly of this is our land. It might not be expressed perhaps as forcefully as he had done in Anishinaabe, but it's still there, right? Because a lot of the translators tended to tone down the aggressiveness of the speeches. But that speech you guys read, you can still see it's aggressive even though it's been toned down, right? I find it funny because people dismiss these speeches as well. They were translated. There's all these problems, blah blah blah. But you read the thing and it's like, well, hold on. You can still see that he's mad. You can still see that he wants the land recognized. You can still see these different things in them. It's like, yeah, again, you got to recognize they're translated, and people tried to tone it down and make it more friendly sounding, but they're still not the most friendly in the terms, even though they've been toned down. So.
Could you tell us about the border issues for the Anishinaabe people and Métis of Sault Ste. Marie area?
Well, there's a man by the name of Lord Selkirk, this colonist. He tried to settle people down near Walpole Island, and he tried to settle people in Winnipeg. He described the international border running through the upper lakes, particularly that at Sault Ste. Marie, as a line established by fools. Because what it does is this border, when it's initially put in 1783, doesn't really matter, right? The border doesn't really matter until the 19th century, and then it starts to matter more and more as that century goes on. It really matters a lot since 9/11. And for the Anishinaabe, what it's meant is that our relatives and relations in the Sioux tribe and Bay Mills are becoming more and more distant. At one time, people from Garden River regularly married into the Sioux tribe, right? Like some of my ancestors are Paymonts. There's a lot of Paymonts in the American side. If you look into if you're from Garden or Batchewana and you look into your relatives, you'll find a lot of American Indians in your family trees. And what it is they're not American Indians, they're Anishinaabe. We regularly married, right? Because you don't keep marrying inside the same community, right? That gives you extra toes and things. Or you all end up looking the same. I'll just refrain at that point. And what happens is, there's other problems that crop up, but we used to marry all the time. So we were very familiar with each other's communities. And I remember when we were doing the Hiawatha play at Garden in 2008, as I ran into actually relatives of mine from Sioux, Michigan. They crossed the river to see the play because they remembered some of their relatives being in it, so they thought they'd come see what Garden River was doing. And they got lost. Now you think, band office, Garden River, Highway 17, how'd you get lost? But they drove right by it, and then back again. And then they were talking to me about how they felt like they were foreigners here and didn't fit and everything else, but they are Sioux tribe band members. It's just that they hadn't ever crossed the river before to come to the community, so they had no idea where, what was in the community, what the reception would be, and there was this oddness to it. And people from Garden River I've talked to, some people experience that same oddness on the Sioux tribe community because they don't, they know there's the relations there, but there's not the familiarity, and that's what the border has done to us. There's this Anishinaabe Joint Commission that with the chiefs and politically, all that sort of thing that goes on. Our people, we try to go to the powwows and try to share and deal that. Our people work on either side of the river. On the American side, they don't really work on our side because our government won't let them. But there is this increasing oddness between the two. And that's what the border's done for us. Never mind our rights about crossing, our hunting and fishing rights, our rights in the treaties. It's splitting our communities, and you see this in the sense, this feeling of oddness or otherness when you're in the other's territory and you're visiting your relatives. You shouldn't have that feeling.
Well, on behalf of our history class and the rest of the school, I think we'd like to give you this as a thank you for coming.
Thank you.
With us or to talk to us about Indian history.
Thank you.